we have to thank you all for participating in the lecture series and our speakers and the public. So this has become a really challenging, strong, and very pleasant experience for all of us. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker of today, Davít Khoshtaria. He is the head of the medieval department of the George Chubinashvili National Research Center, and also something like a prominent visiting professor in the history of architecture of Tbilisi State Academy of Arts. You all know him very well, but let me say a very few words about his, let's say, decade-long work on various aspects of architecture in medieval Georgia, including building methods and techniques, patronage, and let's say regional schools, or however you want to call it. He is the author of a very famous book, Churches and Monasteries in Glacieti, published in 2006 and second in 2009, and what I consider a really very important book is Masons in Medieval Georgia, which was published in 2012 and also came out in a Japanese edition in 2020, where he wrote the chapters regarding the organization of medieval construction, building techniques and materials, use of spolia, as well as a chapter of discussing sculptural images of masons. If he is a head of the medieval department of the Chubinashvili Center, does not mean that he has not also interest in modern and contemporary architecture in Georgia and beyond. I just recall his book on old hotels in Tbilisi of 2012 and church building in 19th century Tbilisi, and also urban planning and architectural design in the cities of Georgia, so also urbanistic approach. That's not all, but I will stop in a second, just saying that it's very important to know that he's also involved in cultural heritage management and preservation projects. For example, the leader of a team of experts for the management plan for the Gennady Monastery in 2014 and 15, and now the conversation will have a conservation project of the masonry of the Jwari Church in Musketa, which is one also of the places he circles around, and not only Davít Khoshtaria, but all people who study, let's say, Georgian art and architecture, not only art and architecture. So I'm happy to welcome you again. Davít will speak about church building in East Georgia from the 5th to the 7th century, masons and patrons. So please, Davít.
Okay. Thank you, Gerhard, for this introduction. My talk is intended to highlight some key points in Georgian architecture from the 5th to the 7th centuries, with a special focus on several most important monuments, and to provide new insights into the early medieval architecture of Georgia, by discussing planning concepts, building techniques, decoration, as well as the aspects of function, meaning, and patronage. I'll start the story from the, okay, let's share. I'll start the story from the late 5th century, a period of Iranian domination in the Caucasus, including both Eastern and Western Georgia, Iberia, and Lazica. The shift of allegiance had a substantial impact on the region, which led to an increase in the Iranian cultural influence and the spread of Zoroastrianism throughout Iberia, especially in the 450s and 60s. However, King Vakhtang Gorgasali of Iberia, being a vassal of Iran, remained irreconcilable towards fire worshipping. He significantly contributed to strengthening the Georgian church by supporting the elevation of the Bishop of Tscheta to the rank of Catholicos, and by establishing 12 new episcopal sees. In matters of faith, King Vakhtang always resisted his Iranian patrons, sometimes doing so in an openly confrontational way. Georgian historical tradition highly praised King Vakhtang's efforts. In the chronicle of his life, compiled about 300 years after his death, he is depicted as a hero, as a powerful ruler. The image of Vakhtang Orgasali as a brave warrior who successfully fought the Iranians was firmly imprinted in the collective memory of Georgians. However, authentic written sources show something of a different situation. The donor inscription of Bolnisi Cathedral, known as Sioni, that is Zion, records the patronage of the local bishop Davit, but does not mention Vakhtang, despite the fact that he was the founder of the episcopal see in Bolnisi. Instead, the inscription refers to the Iranian king Peroz and even calculates the date of the construction from the year of his accession to the throne. Bolnisi Cathedral is a basilica with 5 pairs of cruciform piers and a projecting apse. In addition to a nave and 2 aisles, the cathedral has a stoa to the north and a porch and a 2-apsed baptistry to the south. As a precisely dated building, the cathedral is important for understanding the liturgical planning of early Christian Georgian churches. 2 aspects deserve special attention here. The first is the division of the internal space by gender. According to Natalia Chitishvili's recent, very convincing observation, the western part of the nave and aisles was separated from the rest of the space by means of a barrier and was allocated for women. This part had a special entrance from the north. The inscription above the entrance mentions Azarocht and Parnavas, apparently a noble couple, as a donors to the arrangement of this door. It is the earliest reference to a female patronage in Georgia. The second important aspect is the arrangement of the sanctuary. In Bolnisi, there are no additional rooms on the sides of the sanctuary. A similar layout was applied in the first Svetitshoveli Cathedral in Tsketa, built by King Vakhtang in around 500, shortly before his death. Here too, the projecting apse is not flanked with subsidiary rooms. These 2 prominent examples suggest that basilicas in Georgia had no pastoporia until at least the year 500. The masonry technique of large ashlar blocks of greenish volcanic tuff is an integral part of the architectural design of the cathedral. The blocks face a mortared rubble core, which embodies about half of the wall's total thickness of 105 centimeters. Thus, facing stones are not just facing, but structural elements of the wall. The original masonry, which is best preserved on the eastern facade, is distinguished for its thorough finishing. On the apse, the surface of each facing stone is hewn in a curved line to follow its semicircular shape. Bolnisi Cathedral is the earliest church in Georgia to have a developed stone-carved decoration. Along with foliage and geometric ornaments, the capitals of the pilasters and columns are adorned with the images of animals. Some of these images are typical early Christian representations, such as a pair of peacocks facing each other and flanking a cross in the center. Others are related to Sasanian art, both in their iconography and style. Apparently, the main medium for transferring artistic methods was metalwork. For instance, the sculptor of Bolnisi adopted the Sasanian metalworkers' method of depicting a lion's mane by means of stylized spiral curls. The motifs and forms could also have been transferred through movable stucco panels. It is known that Sasanian architectural sculpture is stucco sculpture. Translated into stone, the images show a certain deviation from Sasanian patterns. The same can be said about Bolnisi's floral ornaments, among which prevails a palmette. Around 490, King Vakhtang Gorgasali constructed a cathedral in the newly founded see in Manglisi. It was a special place. According to tradition, the first church was built there as far back as the 4th century to house the nails of the true cross sent by Emperor Constantine to King Miriam. In Georgian chronicles, the story is vague and contains obvious anachronisms and discourse. For instance, some sources mention the supedaneum, that is footrest of the true cross, instead of nails, while others refer to the both. However, it is fact that at least since the late 5th century, it was commonly believed that relics that had borne witness to Christ were kept in Manglisi. Their possession made Manglisi the all-Caucasian center for pilgrimage. The cross of Manglisi is often mentioned equally with the cross of Ptscheta as one of the 2 holiest sites in Georgia. Along with Georgians, Armenian pilgrims also frequented the place. Later, at the beginning of the 7th century, when the severance between Armenian and Georgian churches occurred, Armenian Catholicos specifically warned pilgrims to refrain from visiting Manglisi. In the 1020s, Manglisi Cathedral was completely reconstructed and lost its initial outer architectural shape. However, the 5th century structure remains identifiable in the interior. A tetraconch inscribed in the outer octagon with 4 small chapels with apses arranged in messy walls diagonally toward the main axis. Thomas Kaffenberger, who recently conducted a thorough study of Manglisi, leaves the question about the arrangement of the eastern part open, admitting that the sanctuary could have been elongated to the east. Actually, his doubts are valid, since there is practically nothing left of the original sanctuary. However, such planning in an early church in Georgia is unlikely. Even taking into consideration the special function of the church, it is difficult to assume that it would have had an elongated sanctuary. Most likely, it was inscribed in the regular octagon and also had a pair of diagonal chapels to the east. What might the sources of the planning concept of Manglisi have been? Annegret Blond-Geluning points to a certain similarity with the Theotokos Church built on Mount Gerizim in the 480s. Thomas Kaffenberger additionally mentioned Kathisma Church on the way from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, a ruined structure of an even earlier date. Both were pilgrimage churches, and their descriptions or sketches may have been brought to Georgia by pilgrims. Indeed, both are octagonal, and the idea of chapels disposed along diagonal axis could have been borrowed from these churches, but that's where the similarities end. Manglisi Cathedral is a very important building in terms of the development of planning concepts. It seems to be the first link in the chain of Caucasian tetraconch churches with corner rooms. In Georgia, the idea was further reinterpreted in Ninotsminda Cathedral, a tetraconch with diagonally disposed 2 apsid chapels inscribed in the outer 8 foil. And finally, it was reinterpreted in the Church of the Holy Cross at Ptscheta. Manglisi Cathedral was the largest centrally planned church in Georgia for about a century. The site of its central square bay measures about 7 meters. The task of covering a space of this size would have been a challenge for 5th century builders. The unusually thick walls of the cathedral would provide a necessary support to the heavy stone vaulting. In search of structural stability, early Christian Georgian master builders tried at least two different vaulting techniques to cover the central bay, a dome and a domical vault. And it seems that in the case of relatively large bays, they preferred the latter to the former. That is, they preferred a domical vault to a dome. This is just a schematic image of the octopartite domical vault. There is a well-preserved example of an octopartite domical vault in Shiombuime Monastery near Mtsketa in the Church of St. George Baptist, dating from the 570s. Please don't pay attention to this painting, which is the late 19th century. Another 6th century example is the Church of 40 Martyrs at Davityan. Most likely, the Cathedral of Ninotsminda was initially also covered with an octopartite domical vault. Early dome churches in Georgia have octagonal drums resting on squinches thrown astride the corners of the central square bay, a structure unknown to early Christian Constantinople, but customary in Cappadocia, Turabdin, and especially in Armenia. The squinch was adopted from Sasanian architecture, to which South Caucasian builders owed not a little of their technical knowledge. Structural prototypes of the Georgian and Armenian squinches can be seen in renowned palaces of Firuzabad and Sarvistan, where four large conical squinches straddle the corners of a square hall, forming a rounded but not perfectly circular base for the dome. The lack of geometric precision of design can be explained, at least partly, by the building technique of Iranian masons who used brick and rubble. To the contrary, the masonry technique of smoothly hewn large stones used by the South Caucasian builders was conducive to the clarity of architectural forms. In the architecture of Georgia and Armenia, the squinch has a clear conical form, like an open half funnel set on its side, which is why it is sometimes called the trumpet squinch. It is built of wedge-shaped stones fanning out from the inside corner to the frontal arch of the squinch. The squinch proved to be the most appropriate device for early medieval Georgian stone structures, both technically and aesthetically, and was in use until the 10th century in domed buildings of various plans. Now I'd like to proceed to the discussion of the church in Zromi, one of the most important early medieval buildings in the Caucasus, both from the architectural and historical points of view. Having been thoroughly studied and published by Georgi Chubinashvili almost a century ago, it still remains underestimated. Surprisingly enough, it also lacks the appreciation of the general public. Zromi is almost never visited by tourists who overcrowd other heritage sites in Georgia. The reason for this may be a disadvantageous location on the plain in the middle of a gloomy village. We are used to the captivating natural setting of medieval Georgian monuments that produce such a vivid impression on the spectator. Zromi is a rare exception, but its bleak environment is fully offset by its architectural beauty. We know almost nothing about the urban history of Zromi. Apparently, in the 5th century, an Iranian garrison was accommodated there. This fact may suggest that Zromi was something more than just an ordinary village, but the chronicles do not mention it among early Georgian cities and towns. Moreover, Zromi has never been an episcopal see, though its church is larger than many early medieval Georgian cathedrals. It is hard to believe that a church of this size and design could have been built just to serve the local congregation. Obviously, it would have had a more important function. According to tradition, the church is erected on the place where Saint Rajden, the proto-martyr, a 5th century Iranian convert to Christianity, was executed. An Iranian nobleman, he was accompanying the Princess Balendurt to Iberia as a member of her guard when she married King Vakhtang. Finding himself in a predominantly Christian environment, Rajden converted to Christianity. The Iranians did not forgive him for his apostasy. He was taken captive and tortured to death by an Iranian commander in Tromi. The Georgian church canonized Rajden, referring to him as a proto-martyr, since he was the first Christian martyr in the country. Rajden was buried on the site of his martyrdom in Tromi, but sometime later, King Vakhtang reburied him in Nicosia Cathedral. This was an act with a clear political implication. A few decades earlier, Nicosia was one of the centers of Zoroastrianism in Iberia. Vakhtang established an episcopal see there and built the cathedral at the heart of a fire temple. These are the words of the chronicler. When reburying the martyrs tortured by Iranians on the former site of Zoroastrian worship, the Iberian king sought to demonstrate his independence from Iran in religious matters. Such a daring challenge to the suzerain might have occurred after the Georgian Armenian revolt of 482, which had forced the Iranians to become more flexible in their policy towards the Caucasian countries and to tolerate disobediences even when they had an openly provocative character. The reburial of Saint Rajden was accompanied by a grand ceremony with the participation of the Iberian royal family. Subsequently, King Vakhtang continued efforts to establish the cult of the martyr. The chronicle of his life says that he built a church dedicated to Saint Rajden in his capital town of Ujarma. According to a later source, even 2 churches. The 8th century inscription in the interior of the extant church provides an early textual testimony to the cult of Saint Rajden. Despite the reburial of Saint Rajden in Nicosia Cathedral, Tromi retained its focal role in the cult of the martyr. It was the place of the martyrdom and first burial of Saint Rajden, rather than his final resting place, that became the locus sancta for his cult. The first martyrium on the site of Saint Rajden's execution in Tromi would have been built in the late 5th century. Though not mentioned in written sources, this is witnessed by archaeological evidence. Remains discovered on the site include 8 drums and 4 broken fragments of small column shafts. At present, the majority of these remains are heaped in the narthex of the church, which is definitely not the best way to present important architectural artifacts, but at least they are protected. Each drum has a height of about 95 centimeters and diameter of about 25 centimeters, without signs of entasis. 2 are with hypotracheliums, that is, they are top stones of the column shafts. The drums have round holes at their tops and bottoms, which suggests that they were linked to each other and their capitals by vertical iron or maybe wooden dowels set into these holes. The holes go deep enough into the body of the drums to provide a sufficient anchorage length so that the dowels would not be pulled out in case of an earthquake. Judging from the diameter, the column shafts would have been about 180 centimeters high, which means that they were composed of 2 drums. Due to a long stay in the ground, the columns have lost their original color and texture, becoming dark and matte. However, the drum broken 40 years ago shows a completely different color in the fracture. Even with the naked eye, one can see that it is marble. A study carried out by petrologists has revealed properties typical for Proconnessian marble, such as gray streaks and bands and a coarse-grained structure. Proconnessian marble was one of the most popular and common marbles from antiquity, not only owing to its aesthetic qualities, but also because of the location of the quarry on a small island next to the harbor, which facilitated its transportation and in turn determined its relatively low price. It was quarried from the archaic period, and from the 1st century AD, the quarries became imperial properties. Its extraction was intense up to the late 6th century. Proconnessian marble was widely exported in the form of ready architectural elements, columns, capitals, blocks for pavement and revetment, as well as sarcophagi. They are found across a broad region from the Western Mediterranean to Eastern and Northern Black Sea shores. There were whole networks of craftsmen, merchants, and officials who operated the highly profitable marble trade. To all appearances, the marble furnishings of the martyrium in Tromi, which apparently originally included many more elements than the surviving columns, were made in the Proconnesus marble workshops and brought to Iberia. King Wachtan could order them through his connections with the imperial court, which became closer after 485, when in his second marriage, he married Helena, a princess from the family of the Emperor Zeno. Columns in Tromi were not the only example of the use of Proconnessian marble in Georgia. Preserved marble details reused in later buildings show that they were exported in large quantities to Western Georgia and sometimes to Eastern Georgia too. For instance, a 5th century spolia is built into the episcopal throne in the main church of Gelati Monastery. Two slender fluted columns of the same period stand at the sanctuary of the main church in Martvili Monastery. The best known example of the use of spolia in a new architectural context can be seen in the church of Hobby. Its story is told in the inscription made on the wall of the church. In around 1390, Prince Vamek-Dadiani led a victorious campaign in Gcheti region to punish the locals for disloyalty. He conquered 2 fortresses, took hostages, and having finished with his military aims, despoliated a ruined early Christian church. He removed a huge collection of Proconnessian marble details to Hobby and applied them to the southern annex of the church, making it a burial chapel for his family. The set of spolia includes columns with capitals, lateral barriers and screens of an ambo, revetment slabs, and other fragments. The fact that Vamek-Dadiani decided to take this heavy trophy about 150 kilometers, as well as the special mention of marble columns and slabs in the inscription dedicated to his victory, show that the prince highly appreciated these architectural details. He included them in the family burial chapel because they must have been most important to him. Returning to the marble columns of Tromi, it should be noted that one can only speculate about their place and function in the 5th century martyrium. We do not know where they stood or what they supported. Most likely, they were the columns of an altar canopy or a ciborium, rising above the place of the martyrdom of St. Rajden or above his initial grave. Since there were at least 6 columns, maybe 8, the ciborium would have been hexagonal or octagonal. In Tromi, there are also other architectural fragments that derive from the 5th century building. These include 3 drums of a larger column and its capital made of sandstone. The column shaft is fluted with 19 grooves and has a diameter of 45 centimeters. That makes them almost twice thicker than the above described marble columns. The drums have no holes at their tops or bottoms, which means that they were not connected with dowels, since their thickness was enough to provide sufficient stability and prevent disengagement of the shafts. Actually, this is a classical building technique. In most cases, ancient Greek columns were composed of stones merely resting on top of each other without any connection. The capital of this column, it's here for comparison. The capital of this column is related to the late antique varieties of the classical Ionic order, with 12 petal rosettes instead of volutes on the front side and with a relatively high echinus. Its closest parallels, dated to the 5th and 6th centuries, can be found in Syria and Palestine. Also, the fragments of the 5th century martyrium were included in the foundation of the extant church. Stones of a cornice decorated with a row of tiny arches. This is perhaps the most valuable archaeological evidence, as it clearly testifies that the present church was preceded by the earlier one. The ornament carved on the stones was known in early Georgian architecture and can be seen on the eastern facade of the above-mentioned Nicosia Cathedral, dated from the late 5th century. The cathedral underwent numerous reconstructions, and this decoration is one of the few surviving fragments of the original building. Similar ornamentation occurs in the same period in the rural church architecture, for instance, in the 6th century church at Kush. Apparently, the first martyrium in Tromi had been destroyed by the early 7th century. Some of its details, such as the above-mentioned columns, were reused in the later church, which prevented them from disappearing. The extant church of Tromi was built about a century and a half after the first church and was associated with crucial events in the history of the broader region. Medieval chronicles and other narrative sources say nothing about church building in Tromi. The only preserved inscription of the church is brief. It mentions Stephanos, a prince from the local ruling family. Georgi Chubinashvili identified him as Duke Stephanos II and dated the church to the period of his being in power between 626 and 634. Although his reading of the inscription was later challenged by other historians, his dating in general is beyond doubt, since the closest compositional parallels to Tromi, Armenian churches in Mren, Bagaran, and Echmiadzin, date to the same period, the second quarter of the 7th century. It is possible that Stephanos did indeed contribute to construction of the church, but the historical context suggests that it was actually supported by another donor, much more powerful and wealthy than the local duke. That donor would have been the Emperor Heraclius. Construction of the church at Tromi coincided with Heraclius' military campaign against the Iranians. In 627, when marching through Georgia from Lazica to Tbilisi, he would have passed the place of St. Rajden's martyrdom, located close to the main historic road. And he was likely informed about the martyr. Although there is no written evidence, considering the great piety and harsh anti-Zoroastrian sentiments of the emperor, one can assume that he was the initiator and donor of the construction of a new, larger martyrium on the site of the earlier one. This supposition seems even more reasonable, taking into account Heraclius' well-known enthusiasm for building. He was noted for supporting various foundations in the provinces, including churches, fortifications, and aqueducts. While in the Caucasus during the war in 627, he also paid attention to construction. Georgian chronicles credit him with the foundation of 2 churches in Albania, one near Khuzashen and the other in Berduji. Georgian tradition also considers Heraclius the founder of the episcopal see in Atskuri and the donor to construction of the first cathedral there. Heraclius somehow contributed also to the church at Mren in Armenia. In the donor inscription of the church, the date of the construction is calculated from the year of his accession to the throne, and he is referred to as a happily victorious king. Mren's close connection to Heraclius is manifested in the sculpture above the northern door of the church, representing the return of the true cross to Jerusalem by Heraclius. According to Christina Maranchi, Mren Church functioned to affirm allegiances between the emperor and pro-Byzantine Armenian princes. The magnificent size, ambitious architectural design, and high technical quality of Stromy Church also suggest imperial patronage. This can be explained by the increased importance of the cult of Saint Rajden in the context of Heraclius' politics towards Iran. The erecting of a large, imposing church on the site where Iranians martyred the convert to Christianity would be an action with a clear underlying message for both Christians and Zoroastrians. The developed sanctuary with a large apse and flanking rooms confirms that, together with being a martyrium, the church was intended for regular liturgical use. Perhaps it was also envisaged to accommodate pilgrims visiting the site. Stromy heralded new developments in the early medieval architecture of the Caucasus. It is a cross-domed church with 4 freestanding piers supporting the dome. Well, the dome of Stromy Church collapsed in the late medieval period and was completely restored during conservation works in the 1980s. In English language literature, its architectural design is usually described as a short basilica crossed by a transept equal in height and width to the nave. Georgian art historical scholarship puts emphasis on the centralized plan, comprehending it as organized around the central square bay, the nucleus of the building. Therefore, the nave and transept are seen as cross arms adjoining the central bay from all 4 sides to create a cruciform space underneath the dome. The eastern crossarm is continued with an apse of almost the same height. In the exterior, they are not partitioned and form a single hall, which is balanced to the west with a narthex and an open gallery arranged above it. Thus, the dome is strictly centralized. A staircase leading to the gallery exists in the northwestern corner room, which juts out of the rectangle of the plan. Its counterpart room in the southwestern corner is partly open to the outside. Groin vaulted rooms on both sides of the sanctuary also project to the south and north. The rich decoration of the sanctuary of Stromy Church is contemporaneous to the church and may serve as further testimony to the imperial patronage. In the conch, there was a mosaic image of Christ and 2 angels. In 1932, badly damaged fragments of the mosaic were removed and transferred to the National Museum of Georgia. Beneath the conch, there is a fresco painting, also damaged, representing a row of apostles with the Virgin in the center. According to Zazas Hetladze's observation, the mosaic and the fresco form a single integral composition that reflects a theophanic idea and is connected with the Ascension. The walls of the church, inside and outside, are fully faced with smoothly hewn large sandstone blocks. In the center of the east facade, a recessed arch frames the window of the sanctuary. The arch is flanked by two deep and wide niches covered with conical walls. Double colonnades stretching up the inner walls of the niches would have been topped with sculptures, which have not survived to the present day. Zromi is a masterpiece of spatial geometry. Together with the contemporaneous Armenian churches of the same type, Mren, Bagaran, Sedenkayane in Echmiadzin, it is one of the earliest cross-domed structures with 4 freestanding piers. Without doubt, they had an important role in the development of early medieval architecture. The architecture of Zromi Church continues local building practice. Its building technique and structural elements have little to do with Constantinople. If the emperor really was the donor of the construction, as I believe, it is obvious that he did not invite the architect from the capital, but entrusted the work to local master builders. To all appearances, Zromi Church is an important imperial project initiated and supported by Heraclius and carried out by Georgian masons. That's all. Thank you.